Welcome back to the Stories of Northern Life podcast, brought to you by the Sault Ste. Marie Museum. I'm your host, Nicole, and today I am going to be taking you through the history of medicine in the military. So, as I said, today we are looking at military medicine. So, here we're going to start off with pre-World War I. So, before the First World War, wounded soldiers would be taken off the battlefield in makeshift stretchers, sometimes even in wheelbarrows. They would be brought to the surgical tent behind the front lines. The surgeon would have to work as quickly as possible, moving from patient to patient, often without even washing their hands, so they could treat as many wounded as possible. Now, we also have to remember that pre-World War I, we didn't know as much about germ theory. We did not discover germ theory until 1861, and it wasn't even widely accepted until 1890. So that means that we had no concept of the germs and bacteria that could be on our hands, and that we would be passing that from patient to patient. So they didn't know that that is why wounds become infected, and that's why we have to keep the wounds clean so that they don't become infected. It was just this general idea of wounds were going to become infected. That was just part of the healing process back then. So the importance of washing hands and sanitization wasn't a real concern until the late 19th century. Maybe you've heard of Florence Nightingale before. She started to bring in cleanliness a bit into, I would say, more so the hospitals, because that's where like the nurses were stationed in that. So the surgeons were doing their best at the time, but they didn't have like those advancements that we have now. So to save a limb that was like struck by a musket ball or a bullet, the only option sort of at that time was amputation. And especially if you consider it being struck by a musket ball, because a musket ball is so much more dense and traveling at a lower velocity, meaning it's not traveling as fast, it's sort of ripping through more of your tissue and your bone, causing a lot more damage than our bullets do today, because bullets can actually pass sometimes very cleanly through you. They are sort of designed a little bit better than the musket balls were before. So in the late 1800s, there is a growing number of hospitals and increased patient intake. So we did have hospitals before, but the hospitals were sort of for the lower class. Now hospitals are becoming a little bit more so for everybody. Nursing was also becoming professionalized, so also with Florence Nightingale pioneering modern nursing during the Crimean War, you start to have more of that professional field of nursing being developed. Now looking at medicine during World War I. And so this is where we come into a little bit more what our soldiers would have been using. So the Canadian Army Medical Corps, or CAMC, was founded in 1904, and it massively expanded in World War I. When the war started, there was an outpouring of female volunteers ready to take up the role of nurse. Their work raised the prestige of nursing after the war. With the advent of military hospitals, they could now get the wounded to the hospital with proper facilities for operations, treatment, and recovery, because these were sort of little pop-up hospitals that they could have really close to the front lines, whereas before they would have been way far away. So the faster you can treat a patient, the more likely the chance of survival. The wounded would be taken to the hospitals in either horse-drawn wagons or train cars, depending on where they were. During the Battle of Marne, the issue of patient transportation became an issue when soldiers were left on the side of the train tracks near Meaux with no way to transport the wounded from the train to the hospital. U.S. Ambassador Herrick called all his friends with vehicles to transport the soldiers to the hospital. This was the start of the Motor Ambulance Corps. Looking at the transportation of the wounded. When soldiers were wounded on the battlefield, they had to take a long journey to the hospital. Here is the chain of events that the wounded would have to go through in World War I and World War II. The walking wounded had to make it behind the front lines on their own. Other more severe cases were helped by comrades or stretcher bearers. Once behind the front lines, the wounded went to the regimental aid post, set up 200 to 300 meters behind the front. Here, they cleaned and dressed the wounds, administered pain medications, if available, and provided basic first aid care. From there, they either returned to duty, if not serious, or were transported to the dressing stations. So these dressing stations were set up about 400 meters behind the regimental aid post and were part of the field ambulance unit. They would be set up in ruined buildings, bunkers, or anywhere under cover from shell fire or air attacks. They were slightly better equipped than the aid posts, but still only provided limited medical care with limited patient capacity. From here, they were treated so they could either return to their units or be taken to the field ambulances. The field ambulances were mobile frontline medical units made up of officers, enlisted personnel, and nurses. They had stretcher bearers, operating tents, cookhouses, washrooms, and horse-drawn or motor ambulances. Later, fully equipped surgical teams were added to the units. The ambulances brought them to the casualty clearing station. Now, casualty clearing stations were located near railways, waterways, or roadways for easy transport to the hospitals. These stations had medical and surgical wards, operating theaters, kitchens, morgues, etc. Patients could stay to be treated and recover, as they could host anywhere from about 200 to 500 patients or up to 1,000 during mass casualties. Patients could then move on to hospitals via train, boat, or road convoys. They would be taken to base hospitals owned and operated by the military or to the public hospitals. They were mainly located on the French coast or in England. They also had military hospital ships, which were requisitioned and converted passenger liners. These ships would transport the patients across the English Channel to British ports or across the ocean to American military hospitals. And now let's look at medical advancements that came about during World War I. So it's kind of interesting to look back in history. If you look at all the wars and the medicine that was being used during that wartime, there was a lot of medical advancements that came about from war just because of the mass casualties, the sort of makeshift treatments you sometimes had to come up with because of lack of supplies. You also started to come up with ways to improve medicine, improve treatment, improve surgeries, because you wanted the best chance of survival for your patients. So in regards to World War I, just with the mass number of wounded and casualties experienced during World War I, medical professionals had to innovate as well. The military advancements of World War I changed the face of war. We were moving from sort of the slow-moving front lines to tanks and now trench warfare. So with all of this, medicine had to advance as well to keep pace with the weapons. Medicine moved from amputations as sort of the only solution to surgeons being able to repair wounds and sometimes even preserve the limb. They now had antiseptic to treat the wounds and sanitize medical instruments and hands, which staved off infection to improve healing and the rate of survival. However, they did not have antibacterials, so there was still the problem of gangrene. It was a severe bacterial infection that thrived in wet places like the trenches. So to prevent death from gangrene, research was done, and the Karl Denken method was created. Debris and necrotic tissue were removed, and the wound was irrigated with Denken's solution, which killed the bacteria without burning the flesh. And this was widely adopted during the war. At this time, anesthesia was also being widely accepted and adopted at this time. So the first research on nitrous oxide and ether as anesthesia was done in the late 18th century, and it was rejected, but we actually started to see people having ether parties because ether sort of gave you a little bit of that high. So people started to have ether parties. Everybody would go and party. So although ether was rejected as used for anesthesia in surgeries, it was a party drug. And then in 1846, an American doctor who was at one of these ether frolics saw that this one guy, he got really injured. Maybe he fell down, or I forget the exact story, but he saw that he had no reaction to the pain. He just was getting up. He was fine. It was everything. So the doctor was thinking, okay, so he sort of numbed to this pain. I wonder if I could use this in my surgery. So he started performing surgery with ether, and he realized that his patients had a better time during surgery. They weren't writhing in agony as they were before, but also their recovery was a lot better as well. So though medical professionals were slow to adopt this, and it was not widely used until about the end of the 19th century. But patients can now be put under to perform delicate life-saving surgeries without the patient being awake, but also moving. So this way you could just make sure that the patient isn't jostling about while you're performing surgery, which also leads to great recovery. So other medical advancements to come out of World War I were facial reconstruction surgery, or plastic surgery as we know of today, and also the regular use of blood transfusions. With the shrapnel injuries and the first uses of poison gas in 1917, many soldiers had facial injuries where they lost parts of their face. Surgeons found ways to reconstruct noses and parts of the face with to both improve the patient's medical condition, but also improve their appearance so they could integrate better back into society. Although still a new practice, medical professionals were using blood transfusions to stem the loss of blood for that the wounded soldiers were experiencing. So now let's look at what medical advancements were coming out of World War II. So World War II saw advancements in antibiotics. They were using sulfa drugs, which were developed in 1935, and penicillin, which was developed in 1939. So during World War II, Germans began to use metal plates to heal fractures. This was discovered and adopted by the Allies when they x-rayed wounded German POWs. They found that bones set with metal plates healed in half the time, and soldiers could go back on duty sooner. So now let's look at advancements during the Korean War. So during the Korean War, wounded soldiers stood an even greater chance of survival with the advent of MASH units. Now, I don't know how many of you know, maybe some of the little bit older generations out there know the original movie MASH or the TV show MASH. Amazing show, amazing movie. Definitely recommend watching. Its depiction of the Korean War, the surgeries, all that medicine, and even sort of just the realities of that the soldiers were experiencing over there. It's a very great depiction of that, so definitely recommend. It's also sort of a comedy, dark comedy, I would say, but definitely recommend giving that a watch. So MASH units were mobile army surgical hospitals, hence the name MASH. They became more popularly known in the 1970 movie and 1972 sitcom MASH, as I said. So these MASH units were designed to bring experienced medical personnel closer to the front lines. The sooner a patient could be treated, the greater the chance of survival, as I said before. They were designed to be deconstructed, moved, and reconstructed in 24 hours as the front lines changed. So they wanted to be able to pack up and bug out, as you might sometimes hear, in case the enemy was like advancing and they needed to get out of there as fast as possible. They had around 60 beds and 24/7 surgical and nursing staff. The wounded were treated with first aid on the battlefield and then stabilized at battalion aid stations before being brought to the MASH units. So if you sort of remember the transportation from World War I and World War II that I was talking about, that transportation chain, you can see how this transportation chain here during the Korean War was limited to only a few steps to that hospital instead of the whole long list of steps. And so at these MASH units, they brought about improvements in resuscitation, trauma care, blood storage and distribution, patient triage, and evacuation. Another major advancement in the Korean War was the medevac helicopter. The main type used was the Bell H-13. So they could now transport patients faster and more easily. They could airlift the most severe cases off the battlefield and reduce the patient load for ground troops transporting the wounded to the battalion aid stations and then onto the MASH units. The terrain in Korea was mountainous and treacherous, so air transports was not only faster but safer. So now let's look at medical advancements during the Vietnam War. So during the Vietnam War, we saw the development of frozen blood. So normally blood lasts about 21 to 30 days. So therefore proper storage is required. In the train of Vietnam, there was no easy way to keep the fresh blood stored. So they found a way to freeze the blood so they could now store mass amounts of blood for up to a year. Burn care was advanced with the advent of antiseptic and antibiotic soaked dressings, which helped to keep burns clean and also ensure that infection didn't set in. Along with the improved dressings, burn patients were given better fluid management during recovery, as they often lacked the necessary hydration to properly recover. As soldiers were arriving in Vietnam, they had to adjust to the hot and humid climate. To make this transition easier, the soldiers went through acclimatization during transport. Aboard the transportation ships, the soldiers had exercise regimens in hot, humid rooms to get ready for the new environment. They were also given balanced salt solutions like Gatorade to help with the adjustment. So here we see sort of like the first types of electrolytes being sort of used. With these regimens, the soldiers were ready to go as soon as they landed. So this might not seem sort of part of the medical care because, you're just getting the soldiers sort of climatized for battle. But if you had all these soldiers sort of just like instantly almost being hit with this hot, humid weather and then being expected to just like jump into battle, you'll start to see a lot of that exercise fatigue, like severe heat strokes, things like that. So by acclimatizing them, you're actually reducing the load that you'll see in the hospitals just for these cases of the sudden new environment. Now, another huge advancement in medicine to come out of the Vietnam War was the recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. PTSD had been earlier recognized as an outcome of war, but it was not seen as a real problem or disorder. So during the Civil War, it was known as lost heart. Then we have shell shock in World War I and battle fatigue in World War II. Some other names that they used were soldier's heart, combat fatigue, and war neurosis, to name but a few. However, things were about to change. A Veterans Affairs psychiatrist carefully described PTSD and made it into a recognized diagnosis after treating many Vietnam veterans. Since PTSD, or now post-traumatic stress disorder, has been recognized, soldiers can now get treatment and recognition for what they are going through. With war comes great leaps in medicine that we have otherwise, that would have otherwise taken much longer. Although the medical profession benefits from these advances, they never want it to come at the cost of war. So there is a bit about wartime medicine. I hope you have enjoyed this episode, and you can come in and check out our military gallery and learn more about our soldiers in the local 49th Field Regiment who did participate in many of these battles. So thanks for listening. Bye.
If you enjoyed this episode, you might like our blog too. Head over to our website, SaultMuseum, that's SAULT museum.ca, and look under Discover. You will find our blog, Museum Musings. We share short synopsis of influential people, historic places, and impactful events in our history. Pictures are always included, and you will be sure to learn a little something new with each post.
Today's quote from the Ermatinger family of Sault Ste. Marie by Gladys McNeese is written by Alexander Vidal when he was here doing his town plot survey in 1846. So he was describing the Ermatinger property in the report he submitted to the provincial government. So here's the quote. The dwelling house is of stone 2 stories high, and other large buildings of wood. They were erected and the land fenced in and cultivated by Mr. Ermatinger 30 years ago. The buildings and fences are much more out of repair. 26 acres formerly enclosed, but now only 14 remain under cultivation at present. The lot has frontage of 12 chain.